There are very basic, simple things. That there is a debt cycle. There are short debt cycles. We're used to those. They last on average about 7 years, give or take about 3. And you have a recession, and interest rates are low, inflation is low, and the Federal Reserve becomes stimulative, and then you have growth. You have non-inflationary growth, and you have inflationary growth, and they tighten monetary policy, and then you have the slow up or the recession that follows until the cycle participates. It happens that way. We've had 12 of those. We're in the 13th. We're about halfway through that cycle. We're at the point where interest rates have to rise. Okay, so the level of interest rates, you have to satisfy a debtor and a creditor. And so that means interest rates have to be high enough that the creditor gets a real return, higher than their money. And if you don't do that, you create the cycle that we had before, where money is essentially free, interest rates are nil, or in some cases negative, and you have a situation where you don't have to pay principal, so money was essentially free. Then that imbalance is enormous, and it's made more enormous because even then the supply-demand is not adequate. There's not enough demand to buy those bonds. And so the Federal Reserve's got to come in there and print money and buy those bonds and redistribute wealth. So you have that difference. So now we have moved to a level of real interest rates. Think about inflation. That is, depending on how you calculate, if you look at the tips or if you look at short-term interest rates, they need a 1 to 1.5% real rate. Those days that we have seen in the past are over, and there's a big adjustment in that. So the headline for that is, so who have been the losers? Who have been the winners and who have been the losers? This is a different kind of debt problem, in that what happened is, in order to create this big transfer of wealth that there needed to be in various ways, the government borrowed a lot of money because they spent a lot more than they earned, and they sell a lot of bonds. And then the Federal Reserve buys bonds, and it subsidizes those bonds. And so the big losers of this cycle has not been the individual balance sheets, because the individual balance sheets have been improved. It is the fact that those who are holding government debt are the ones that are having the losses. So the central banks have all lost a lot of money. The commercial banks bought a lot of these debts. So when we look at the commercial banking problem, it is largely a government debt problem, because there was the financing of holding bonds with short-term interest rates, and so that was the squeeze. So you have that particular dynamic. As we move forward, the higher you raise the debt to income ratio, the more difficult that balancing act becomes. And so we're seeing a trade-off now that interest rates have got to be high enough for the creditor, but not too high for the debtor. And so you're seeing now this adjustment in which you're having sort of a 1%-ish growth rate, not the household sector having a problem, but those who are holding the bonds and so on, they're having the problems. And so you're seeing growth come down with still an inflation issue. The inflation issue comes from two parts, really. First of all, if you spend a lot more than you earn and you give a lot of money in credit, you're going to have inflation. But it also comes from the supply-demand of bonds. So if you look at who's benefiting in this, the household sector, the workers, are benefiting. This isn't a classic recession in which the unemployment rate goes up, because the unemployment rate is remaining relatively good because there's wealth transfer, and you have, and they are also having higher wage gauges. And then you have the inefficiency of the global supply chains, which happens there. So what that means, I think, is that you have this stubbornly high inflation. We're not going to go down to our targets for a number of reasons. And then there has to be the real interest rates remaining high in that. And that creates a sort of stagflation kind of environment.